Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Andrew Martin, Dean of the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts. I'm here to introduce today's lecturer, Jason Owen-Smith, the Barger Leadership Institute Endowed Professor and Director. Following the lecture, I would like to invite you to join us for a reception right outside in the concourse. Today, we are paying tribute to two individuals who have made transformational differences for undergraduate leadership education. Dave Barger's dedication to leadership learning has made a lasting impact on industry and on our university. Today, we celebrate his contributions as well as the accomplishments of the recipient of this endowed professorship, Jason Owen-Smith. Dave Barger is an LSA alumnus and generous donor to the university. He established the Barger Leadership Institute to create powerful leadership learning experiences for undergraduates, extending undergraduate education through international internships and research focused on the study of organizations and leadership. The BLI was created to provide a forum that joins faculty, students, and innovative leaders in collaboration, action learning projects, and strengthen the college's commitment to the multidisciplinary understanding of organizations and leadership. Dave is best known for co-founding JetBlue Airways. From the time of its founding in 1998 until his retirement in 2015, Dave served in leadership roles including Chief Operating Officer, President, and CEO. In recognition of more than 30 years in the industry, Barger was awarded the 2016 L. Welch Pogue Lifetime Achievement Award by the International Aviation Club. Widely recognized as a top air transportation industry leader, Dave is sought for his knowledge of business strategy and execution. He's known for sharing his passion for community involvement, service, and education. Dave serves LSA on the Dean's Advisory Council and Organizational Studies Advisory Committee, and serves on a number of boards, both for-profit and not-for-profit. He recently retired from the Flight Safety Foundation Board of Governors after 15 years of service. Dave established this professorship in the Barger Leadership Institute to elevate leadership education at the University of Michigan. It would be hard to overstate the importance of endowed professorships to any college or university, public or private. Endowed chairs have long been used by institutions of higher learning to honor faculty members that have shown considerable academic excellence in teaching and scholarship. Such chairs are typically reserved for scholars of international stature, and endowed chairs have proven to be very effective methods for recruiting and retaining the very best and brightest faculty. An endowed professorship denotes reverence, both on the scholar holding the chair and also on the college or university that can award it. The very presence of faculty of such renown also goes a long way in bringing the best students to the university, because quite simply, the best faculty attract the very best students. This is precisely the type of honor that Dave Barger has bestowed upon us with his gift for the professorship, which is awarded to a professor who has demonstrated commitment to and excellence in leadership education. Professor Jason Owen-Smith exemplifies that commitment and that excellence. Jason Owen-Smith earned his Bachelor of Arts degree in Sociology and Philosophy from the New College of Florida and an MA and PhD in Sociology from the University of Arizona. He joined the sociology faculty here at Michigan in 2002 and was the first faculty member ever hired into our new Organizational Studies program. After earning tenure, he became director of BLI in 2010 and also served as interim director of Organizational Studies from 2010 to 2012. Under Professor Owen-Smith's leadership, BLI has grown and become a distinct program in which undergraduates across campus learn to become better leaders through experience. In 2015, Professor Owen-Smith founded the Institute for Research on Innovation and Science with initial support from the Alfred P. Sloan and Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundations. IRIS is a national consortium of universities who share data to enable analysis and reporting that will help us better understand, explain, and improve the public value of the university research mission. I can't imagine any other project more timely than that. Through his leadership of both BLI and IRIS, Professor Owen-Smith is leading the kind of experiments in undergraduate education and academic research that are developing creative and innovative answers in higher education. Findings from Jason's research have far-reaching impacts, from the life sciences to technology to management and, of course, sociology. The excellence and breadth of his work are reflected in his body of work, which includes numerous journal articles, book chapters, essays, and a book forthcoming on Stanford University Press, tentatively titled Beautiful Accidents: How Research Universities Promote Our General Welfare. In his new book, Professor Owen-Smith examines the distinctive role that research universities, and particularly their scientific and scholarly research, play in ensuring the health, wealth, and well-being of the United States and the world. He discusses how these institutions create and sustain a system that is uniquely suited to create new opportunities and to address unexpected problems. He also addresses how to sustain these institutions and shepherd public support. We will hear more about this in his talk. Please join me in congratulating and welcoming Professor Jason Owen-Smith.
Thank you, everybody, for coming out and listening to me speak. I have to work out all of my various microphones in order to make sure that you all can hear me. Is that good? Awesome. So, again, thank you. Thank you to Dave and everyone else. I'm going to give a talk today that is a couple of things. It is first and foremost an effort to explain to you and hopefully start a conversation how someone like me sees an institution like ours. I'm going to do a few things. See if I can make my clicker work. No, I cannot. So I'm going to come to the podium. I'm going to start with a little bit of background, walk you through a case study that I hope will be interesting, a thought experiment, and then, as Andrew suggested, I'm going to talk a lot about two initiatives that I've been privileged to work on here at Michigan, the Barger Institute and IRIS. And I should say I'm going to talk about those things as if they're me for the sake of convenience, because it's hard to use the plural. But there are many, many people in the room. The IRIS staff are here, for instance. The BLI staff are here, supporters and students. So this is really a collective activity. I'm then going to talk about three metaphors for understanding the university. And for those of you who've seen me do my academic shtick, I'm not going to show you any regression tables. There's not going to be any talk of estimators. So I'm happy to go into the weeds on what I've been doing and what we're talking about. But for this audience, I want to sort of share the content. So, oh, and I forgot my clicker again. Ooh. What's the first piece of background? The title of my talk is Creative Capabilities at Scale. And I think that's the core piece of what universities are and do. But it raises the primary question, the first question, which is, what is creativity? And the answer, for me, as for many folks who study innovation and discovery, is that creativity is a recombinant process. What does that mean? Well, it means there's really not much that is totally new under the sun. That most new discoveries, most creative ideas are the result of combinations of existing pieces of information. That in order to think and to do something new, part of what you have to do is search your environment and bring together things that already exist. And because this is fun, you can think about how that might look. So imagine you were someone like me, about to give a big talk, and you were sitting at home watching your hamsters. I don't really have hamsters, but it's important. And thinking about what to wear. You know, I need something jaunty, something that sends the right professorial signal. And then, boom, voila. Boom. US patent number 5,901,666, pet display clothing. Right? It's a habit trail and a Hawaiian shirt. What more could you want? I mean, this is a goofy example, I'll grant you, and I'm pretty sure this patent has never been licensed or made it into any kind of thing, but it points to the general idea that when we're thinking about creativity and when we're thinking about innovation, what we're thinking about is a moment of insight that is often about bringing together unexpected combinations of things. And so when we're thinking about capabilities, capacities, how we build and sustain institutions and activities that consistently generate new and important things, part of what we should be thinking about is the pieces of knowledge, skills, capabilities that are inside them, and the ways they're put together consistently and well. And that brings us to thinking about the university. So a little bit more throat clearing. When I talk about universities, I'm talking about places like this one. There are lots and lots of colleges and universities that are not like this one. This is one of maybe 100 in the US that do at a very high level research, teaching, public service, graduate and undergraduate education, professional education, across the entire range of human knowledge. I think Andrew has something like 90 different programs and departments and museums and a radio station, I believe. No longer a radio station. We're streamlining the organization. Right? That are all part of the university's knowledge mission. There's lots of public investment in universities. That's obvious at a public university, but I want to suggest that what I'm going to tell you also applies to private universities. And that public investment comes in lots of ways. It comes in research funding, grants, contracts, investments from the federal government. It also comes in the form of nonprofit status, in the form of loans, student loans for students, in the form of state appropriations. One of the things those public funds and that status allows universities to do is to be stable and near permanent parts of our society. So there are two things I know about the University of Michigan. There are more than that, but there are two that I will say. One is that it's not going out of business. This is its 200th year. The other is that it's never going to pick up and move to Alabama, Texas, or Singapore. And that's not something you can say about any other major employer or institution other than, say, a state government that is in this part of the country. And so what that means is that this is a stable, relatively open, very decentralized organization that depends on federal money and state money and the goodwill of the public to do its work. Part of what we want to do is explain and understand how those investments pay dividends. And I will figure this out eventually. You're seeing the learning curve. So having said that, today's message, I'm going to tell a very positive story about universities. And I don't want that to mask the fact that institutions like ours have problems. There are things we could do better. But I'm going to bracket those for now and talk to you about another way of thinking. We tend, in the public discourse, even in the way we talk amongst ourselves, to think of our universities and their various activities in terms of individual returns on investment. A student's return in terms of a job for their tuition. The federal government's return for a particular grant on a project. And that's okay as far as it goes, but I want to say that it sells us short. It's, as I would put it, mostly wrong. And the reason it's mostly wrong is that what universities like ours are uniquely able to do, unlike any other type of organization, is to create and sustain the capabilities to allow us as a society to address problems that we don't know we have yet. Universities, in some fundamental way, are insurance for our common future. I'm going to tell you about how I think about that. But that's the key message. And the idea is that those capabilities are what we should be sustaining, investing in, and thinking about. With tongue firmly in cheek, I'm going to propose a Rumsfeldian view of public value. Donald once said, there are known knowns. This is the kind of stuff that we teach in intro classes, right? There's stuff that we know, that we can convey. This is also the kind of stuff that increasingly students and others can get from places other than universities. There are known unknowns. There are things we know we do not know. Right? Those are the big problems that we focus on. This is where much of the research endeavor of universities is focused, and also where some of the teaching endeavor is focused. But I want to argue with Donald that the real meat, the real place where universities need to be understood and sustained is in thinking about the unknown unknowns. The problems and opportunities that we haven't conceptualized yet, that we don't know how to respond to, and that we might not even know we have. That's the sense in which universities are insurance. So how does that work? Well, I think I have some ideas. One of them, I was talking to a group of folks today down at the golf course, and I used the metaphor of Legos. One of the ways that works is if we think about creativity in terms of recombination, and we think about a university as a repository of as much of human knowledge as we can get. One way to imagine that is to imagine that what a university is a big container with lots of blocks. So that would make these the faculty and students, the ninja and the spaceman, playing with the Lego blocks. The idea being that what's here allows us to make new combinations, to put together ideas that haven't otherwise been combined, and to do them in a situation where when risky combinations, new innovations don't work out, the stability of the institution, its commitment to maintaining knowledge, its commitment to transferring knowledge, mean that we learn anyway. So I want you to bear the Legos in mind, more maybe than Donald Rumsfeld, as we talk a little bit about a case study. When I'm talking about iris out in the world, some of the iris folks will have seen this slide way too many times, and some of them have used it themselves. When we talk about the research function, in our society, US universities spent $215 for every man, woman, and child in the country on research. Now, that's not a lot relative to healthcare or servicing the national debt or any one of a number of things, but it's a substantial amount. And I'm willing to bet that if you stood in the center of our campus on the diag and you drove 10 miles in any direction, plunked yourself down in a coffee shop, and asked the person next to you, hey, do you think $215 of your tax money is a good investment? The answer would not make you happy. Maybe it would, but there's a lot of skepticism. Back into the 1950s, the system that funds research was devised with the promise that basic fundamental research done at places like this would result not just in new knowledge, but eventually in increased well-being, in a better quality of life, in health, wealth, well-being, happiness, all of these good things. But we don't actually know very much about how that happens. We tell a lot of stories. Fund the superconducting super collider and you'll get the next World Wide Web. The moonshot brought us Tang and Velcro. So, in addition to putting us on the moon, it's a good thing. We want to understand and improve those effects. And I want to say we also want to think hard about how teaching students in an environment where research work is going on contributes to just these creative capabilities. So how do we understand and improve these effects? Well, I talked about skepticism. Here's one answer. This is a letter from then Senator Tom Coburn to the man who was then director of the National Science Foundation, Subra Suresh, around the end of era funding after the great financial crash. And it says, even with a smaller budget, we can increase our investments in transformative science and basic research by simply setting priorities and better managing the resources available. While the scientific mind seeks to understand all aspects of the world around us, some research topics are simply more likely to contribute to truly meaningful discoveries or knowledge. That may be true. I don't think so. I'm going to tell you a little bit about why, and I'm going to do it using an example. So, here is one of the prima facie examples for that view of the university research endeavor. In 1994, the National Science Foundation made a $4.5 million grant to Stanford University for something called the Digital Libraries Initiative. That sounds pretty cool. There was a couple of computer science professors. One of the things that grant did was employ these guys. Everybody know who these guys are? Right? In point of fact, the grant employed Larry Page, and Sergey Brin was working on the grant as a graduate research fellow from the NSF. In 1998, Page invented a thing called PageRank, which is the underlying search algorithm that allows Google to bring us all as many cat pictures as we like while listening to a lecture from a professor in a very nice room. The Google patent was owned by Stanford University, and it cited this grant in 1999. The company was official. In 2004, it went public. When I last checked its market cap, it was approaching $750 billion. So again, with tongue firmly in cheek, this is an instance where return on investment on a single project was on the order of, let's call it 178,000%. That's pretty good. The problem is that hidden in this patent and hidden in the story of it are a bunch of other things. So, y'all recognize Page and Brin. Does anybody recognize that guy? His name is Scott Hassan. Scott Hassan was Google employee number 3, basically. Turns out he was another person working on this grant who was a better coder than Page and Brin. They initially implemented this algorithm in a fashion that kept making all of Stanford's servers crash and caused a problem when they were still running Google out of the dorm, and he rewrote it. So if we want to understand this story, at a minimum, we have to think about the people who aren't authors and inventors on these patents, the pool of talent that's in the graduate students and undergraduates around. The things in boxes give us another view. This is what patent geeks, people like me who've spent too much time thinking about intellectual property, call non-patent prior art. It's things that are cited in a patent that aren't themselves patents. Most of these are scientific papers. So, what does this tell us? Well, an important thing to say is that neither the people nor the knowledge that became Google sprang up fully formed. So if we want to talk about the process that led to the outcome, we need to reach further back. One way to reach back is to think about the people. So I see Mary Sue is here. You were actually running this place and sitting with Larry, I imagine, before he gave this commencement address in 2009. But when he gave the commencement address at Michigan, he did not talk about his Bachelor of Science in Computer Engineering. He did not talk about code optimization. What he talked about was the importance of the University of Michigan in his life and his family's life, and the opportunity the University of Michigan allowed him not just to learn the technical skills, but to pursue projects and activities that taught him how to be a better leader. In this case, it was something called Leadership, which is still going on our campus. But the key idea here is that it was not the known knowns that he learned here. It was methods for dealing with the unknown that passed it on. It's also the case that the knowledge didn't spring out de novo. So between 1970 and 1994, we think, the numbers aren't real strong, that the National Science Foundation made about $52 billion of grants. Right? Even the National Science Foundation doesn't know how many grants there were, which is something that one might want to work on. But those $52 billion in grants included these 5. So, does anybody have a sense of what these 5 things might have in common? These are all grants that were acknowledged in papers that were cited by the Google patent. Right? So when you go to the patent office, you can download the original patent application and see the handwritten additions to it. The citations that were made in there are to a set of scientific papers that included grants from NSF over about a 30-year period to at least 5 different universities in fields wildly diverse and separated from computer science and Larry Page. Put it more clearly, 6 grants, if you include the Digital Libraries Initiative, for a total of about $10.5 million made across 30 years, were immediate precursors and helped set the stage for Google. So if we want to think about what investments do and the kinds of capabilities we're creating, we need to think in these terms, and we need to think about a few other things as well. So my favorite is that a sociology grant made in 1974 at SUNY Stony Brook to study director interlocks in order to mathematically demonstrate that there is a power elite that controls the politics and the economics of our society, was one of the early precursors. What else is fun about it is that guy, who's not here today because he's at Stony Brook, he sent me a note, Mark Mizruki, was a graduate student on this grant with his advisor at Stony Brook, and in 1986, he published a tasty, tasty little paper called something like Mathematical Methods for the Decomposition of Eigenvector Centrality in the journal Sociological Methodology. And that paper quickly sank beneath the waves. But it was important because that insight solved a mathematical problem for PageRank that I won't go into, but trust me, I'm happy to talk about it after. So, you don't have to go very far from Google to get to sociology in 1974 and to get to a particular type of Marxist sociology, no less, which is great fun. And you don't have to go very far before you get back to the University of Michigan again. Another thing I like about this. The Stanford DLI proposal itself didn't mention the World Wide Web. So one of the things to remember about this is that this was funded in 1994, which means it was probably written in 1993 or maybe even 1992, depending on how the review process went. The Mosaic browser was introduced in 1993, which means when this grant was written, the World Wide Web was not a thing. Right? The theme of this grant was interoperability, and it started research that allowed talented graduate students working on a project together to discover over the course of the grant that, hey, we might want a means to search this giant new web environment. Right? Again, an important point when thinking about what the investment was and when it was made. Another piece. Incumbent search firms passed on licensing this patent. So let me say that again. Stanford offered this patent to Excite and Lycos and Yahoo, initially for $1 million, which makes me feel like Wayne's World, $1 million. And when no one took it, they cut the price down to $750,000. And no one purchased the rights to the patent. As a result, Page and Brin left and started Google with a bunch of investment from Silicon Valley venture capitalists, and proceeded to destroy the business model of Lycos, Excite. Yahoo was still around, but they had to license from Google the right to use their search engine. Right? What this means is that, for lack of a better term, there's no way that the potential value realized in Google's patent could have been known at the time when important investments were made. And that's very important for us. This would have counted as an unknown unknown in lots of places. So the question becomes, if we want to support more Google-like successes, what do we do? Follow-on question might be, does it matter that we probably know about as much about what we'll need in 30 years as a sociology program officer in 1974 knew about the World Wide Web? And secondarily, given that, how do we teach our students, graduate students, undergraduates, everybody, to be able to navigate and work and get things done and have these interesting insights in a world where we don't know what we need? This is the fundamental question that's been bugging, bedeviling, otherwise bothering me for quite a while now. And it's important in part because Google's an easy problem relative to a lot of the ones we know we face, let alone the ones we don't know we have yet. And that's where the university comes in, and where it's important to start making the transition from thinking about universities as machines for individual returns to thinking about them as social capabilities encoded in organizations, institutions, and networks. That's what'll let us get to the unknown unknowns. And it does it, sometimes I'm asked to give a talk where there's just one slide, and if I could only use one slide, it's this one. You know, two professors at a board. Step 2 is a little unclear. I want to suggest that we need to know much more about step 2 in a situation where our institution and institutions like it are under pressure to explain ourselves on every dimension. And almost all of the explanations come down to the question of what do our students get and what is all this research stuff anyway. So that's what we're trying to do. I'll skip that. Well, I can't. I love this joke. It's like, as one of my friends said, The state of our knowledge right now is essentially like saying Hewlett-Packard and Apple were founded in garages. What we should do is really build some more garages. Right? That's obviously not true, but we don't know much more than that. And so the initiatives that I want to talk about in a second are efforts to figure it out. But before I get there, I want to go back to this question about what universities are and propose a thought experiment. So at the risk of moving away from Michigan and to Badgers, from Wolverines to Badgers, it's a relatively close jump. It's not like they're Buckeyes. Right. In 1901, the president of the University of Wisconsin, which was one of the first and largest and most successful land-grant institutions in the country, coined what was called the Wisconsin idea, a mission statement that was enshrined in the state of Wisconsin's Constitution in, I think, 1973 as the mission for the University of Wisconsin system. And this is it. The mission of the University of Wisconsin system is to develop human resources, to discover and disseminate knowledge, to extend knowledge and its application beyond the boundaries of its campuses, and to serve and stimulate society by developing in students heightened intellectual, cultural, and human sensitivities, scientific, professional, and technical expertise, and a sense of purpose. Inherent in this broad mission are methods of instruction, research, extended training, and public service designed to educate people and improve the human condition. Basic to every purpose of the system is the search for truth. So around here, that's like, oh, this is God and apple pie. But in 2013, the governor of the state of Wisconsin proposed a $300 million budget cut to the University of Wisconsin system. And when he proposed that budget cut, he also proposed a constitutional revision to the system's mission. Right? There was massive outrage and cries and hue and cry, and so the revision to the Constitution didn't happen. The budget cut did, and it's now like deeply engaged in the Packers' new stadium. So one of the interesting questions as we think about public investments is what the trade-offs are. But I want to show you as a thought experiment the proposed mission. So this is what was written in the red line. The mission of the University of Wisconsin system is to develop human resources to meet the state's workforce needs, to discover and disseminate knowledge, and to develop in students heightened intellectual, cultural, and human sensitivities, scientific, professional, and technological expertise, and a sense of purpose. Now, this has the benefit of being shorter. It's about 42 words shorter. It has the benefit of being clearer in the sense that with this, you can ask, is the university working? And the answer is, yes, it is, if students get jobs in the state and state employers get students in the jobs they need. But I want to ask what you all think is lost in this revision. So somebody just yell out. Are there things that are missing in that second revision? Truth. We like truth. What else? Yep, absolutely. So outreach of all kinds. Other things? Graduate education is gone here. That's extended learning. Right. Much is missing. So let's think about it. The collective benefits become individual. Right. Now it's about firms and students. The long time horizons become short. Right. This yokes this directly to the business cycle, and the question is, are people getting the employees they need now? A national and global focus narrows to the state, and as Mary Sue noted, the state focus is much more narrow than what you might expect from a land grant. It goes on and on. The diversity of teaching and research in principle decline because not everything meets the state workforce needs. Right? I'm not sure sociology would count here, despite Mark Mizrachi's 1986 paper in sociological methods. Right? The campus boundaries become tighter. Research, education, and application or service are decoupled. Right? It's no longer research and education together. And the university becomes more tightly wedded to the business cycle, and a lot of the conflicting missions and constituencies are simplified. So if we imagine a great university like the University of Wisconsin working under this new mission, we'd see a very different kind of animal. And what I like to suggest, in truth and improving the human condition both meet the acts, but that goes without saying. What I want to suggest in the too long didn't read version is that every feature of the university that stands to make the next Google or the next solution to a problem like Google possible got cut. That it's precisely these messy, complicated, multi-institutional, multi-mission orientations that make the university the source of these creative capacities. So now, how do we think about those? Well, the short answer, I'm going to tell you, this is an attempt, and I don't know if it'll be successful, but this is the home team, so I'll try. This is an attempt to pull together the two halves of my academic life, the Barger Institute and IRIS. The two initiatives, IRIS, envisioning the future of the research enterprise. The BLI, this is my tagline. I was asked this morning, if I had a 7-word version of what the BLI does. And my close answer is leadership can be learned. Maybe it can't be taught, but we can provide the opportunities and the language and the structure for people to develop it. IRIS is a machine to build a consortium of universities who share data and support infrastructure to allow us to do a type of research that's never been done before in order to be able to really understand and improve the process and products of scientific research in order to get to that public value. The BLI, this is a picture of the BLI's structure, is an experiment. It's been going for 10 years now, so I guess I shouldn't call it an experiment, but we try to keep the experimental life alive in helping create situations for students to do the kind of learning that Larry Page described in his graduation address. The ability to bring together different skills and work with and through different people in situations that are ambiguous or maybe defined by conflicts of various sorts in order to get something interesting done with the knowledge they develop on a campus like this. And these two things are prongs of an effort to make sense of and experiment with what we can do in a university like this to talk and think about and justify creative capabilities. So I'm going to shift and give you, because it wouldn't be a lecture without a PowerPoint that's kind of amateurish, with a lot of arrows. But the idea is that investments of various sorts, public, private, individual, flow into universities, and we tend to get into a habit of talking about what we spend. Right? Jack Hu, our VPR, stands up every year in front of the regents and says the University of Michigan spent $1.4 billion on research. And that's a great number. But I think if you told that to the person 10 miles away in a coffee shop, they'd say, that's a lot of money. My roads have potholes and tuition is too damn high. Right? Doesn't matter that neither the potholes nor the tuition have much to do with the research. We don't do a good job of explaining it. So what we need to do is to think about how those investments enable a certain sort of work on university campuses, what that work produces, and quite critically, how the things that are produced, the new knowledge, the skills, the trained people, flow out into various parts of society and what they do when they get there. To think about that, I'm going to introduce you to these 3 metaphors. So, first, universities are sources of ideas and trained people. Those investments in the work of universities train individuals and teach individuals new things, but they also create standing, stable capabilities, institutions and networks that allow for new creative activities to happen, and that allow for them to happen in a flexible way that makes us responsive to needs that we might not know we have yet. So an example. This is a picture of the collaboration network based on who's paid on the same grant in a given year at a large Midwestern university that shall remain nameless. Right? What we see here is a world in which there's a medical school and there's kind of a land bridge through public health to a social science institute and a bunch of other stuff that's going on. But what this really is a social map of the capabilities to pull together those Lego bricks that are instantiated in the knowledge that's being developed in these grants. So this little section I pulled down, there are 3 grants. One of them is a grant that's behavioral science. It's oriented toward understanding the health and other outcomes for homeless teenagers. The other is an HIV/AIDS vaccine group, and they're bridged by a couple of liver cancer and organ transplant clinicians from the medical school. So this is explicable, right? If you're a homeless teenager, chances are good that you're going to end up with hepatitis C. And if you're working on HIV and it becomes full-blown AIDS, both of those cases, the liver goes. And so having consultants on these 2 grants that are liver transplant specialists is a really important thing, and it points to the ability of this a university in the upper Midwest, that shall remain nameless, of this university to combine social science knowledge and application and bench science knowledge and application through the mechanism of shared connections to clinical scientists. Right? And so what you can do when you think about these networks at scale and you map them and you start to think about the content of them and how they're combined is really get a sense of the research DNA, if you will, of a university like ours. And IRIS right now has 32 universities signed up to share these data across the country, and we're working to get many more. We'll continue to talk about that a little bit, but the idea is that with data like these and with continuing collaboration with these institutions, not only can we understand what's going on, but we can start to talk about it and to tell the story in really compelling ways. But there's another way to think about this, and this is where the BLI comes in. The BLI is also a source in this sense. And these are what we call the Barger Leadership Institute habits. These are the core technology, if you will, of what we think BLI leadership in response to these ambiguous and challenging situations is. And right now, the BLI has more than 500 students from about 80 different majors, from every college on campus that has undergraduates, mostly working together around projects they define, and that's great. The projects are great, what the students learn are great, but what this really is a community and a network that does for undergraduate education much the same kind of combinatory work that we see in research. The idea is to bring together students interested in working on problems in order to develop and sustain creative capability that is built into networks. This is an example of what that looks like in our leadership labs. And you can ask what kinds of networks. This is where the research comes in, and I won't show you models, and this is still being developed, but one, the networks need to be diverse. There's a lot of work, I don't know if Scott Page is here or not, but Scott has done a lot of work, for instance, that suggests the importance of cognitively diverse teams to both define and solve important problems. They need to be balanced, which means there need to be pockets of cohesion where hard work can get done and there's a lot of trust, but there need to be positions where individuals or groups span different types of knowledge and can make those insightful creative recombinations. And they need to be complex, in the sense that, like the university and its store of Lego bricks, knowledge and skills, they have to combine lots and lots of different things, some knowledge that is known to be important now, and some that we don't have a use for, or that might even have at the moment been considered failed. So, that's sources. Universities are also anchors. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but the idea behind an anchor is that stability idea, that universities like Michigan aren't going to move to Alabama. Right? What they do is increase the resilience of markets and industries and communities that they sit on, like an anchor holds a boat in place during a storm. So this is just a map to give you a sense of where research spending flows out of the university. This is vendor purchases across the country from 21 different Irish universities. And the point is that the stimulus effects, the effects of just being present and doing work at a high level in lots of fields, actually results in lots and lots of economic activity that we don't talk about enough. I like this because it allows me to show a picture of a shopping mall. The other way to think about anchors is in a marketing sense. So marketing people call the big stores at the ends of malls the anchor tenants. Right? The anchor tenant defines the characteristics of a mall because it generates the foot traffic. Right? So you don't go to a mall for the shop that has the spangly iPhone cases. You go to a mall for Sears. I don't think Sears exists anymore. I don't go to malls much. Or for Saks. The idea is that these big anchor tenants define the kinds of interests and people that are attracted to an area, and by doing that, they create the possibilities for business of various sorts, not just for profit, in the region by bringing the people. Think about how much Michigan and Ann Arbor, Southeast Michigan, are defined by the influx of students every year and by the kinds of research work we do. I'll skip that. Anchor tenants are important because they have to act in a certain way, and this goes back to the mission of the university. Right? Anchor tenants work well when they're interested, when they try to do work that makes their missions better, but when they have little vested interest in controlling the things around them that depend on them. They also work really well when they allow people to enter them and move through. Imagine a mall where you walked into an anchor tenant and there was no door to the main mall. One of the features of universities is that we turn over the vast majority of the people who work and do our business every 5 or 6 years. The door is open and people move all over with it, and that's an important thing to think about. These are also hubs. We like the term hub around here. But universities serve as hubs in the same way that something like Chicago O'Hare Airport serves as. Right? So the university is metaphorically about one hop from every part of society. Right? This morning I was down in the golf course having conversations with a lot of alumni and others who were supporters of the BLI from all over. Last week I was sitting in a BLI leadership seminar with a Marine 3-star general. Right? The week before that it might have been a judge. Colin Powell is here a little while ago. Politicians, others move through. Part of what makes a university the place where those creative capabilities happen is that it is an open, stable hub at the intersection of almost every part of society, which means that problems and needs and opportunities tend to flow to it differentially over other types of organizations. And when they get here, there are these networks. The knowledge networks of research, the networks of students interested in solving problems that allow us to identify and respond to them. So as an example, this is just a snapshot of where people who were paid on grants who got PhDs at 9 Midwestern universities got their first jobs in industry. It's a who's who of major knowledge-intensive industries. Right? There are not many other institutions that produce people who go on to do work in a huge range of places, and this is a very limited slice. Right? They're also all over the country. So over the last 15 years or so, about 40,000 people were employed on grants at Michigan and left. They got jobs all over the country. Right? In many different industries, nonprofit, for-profit, and key to this, something many people in the room know and that Larry Page talked about, is that they come back. Part of what being an effective university is creating the conditions for a sense of affinity that brings people back with their problems and interests and connects them with what we need in order to address those things. And that's not something that happens pretty much anywhere else. So think about the difference between getting a degree and coming back as an alumni and getting a car and coming back to have the oil changed. Think about the fact that many businesses require their employees to sign non-compete agreements, and it's absurd to imagine a university doing the same thing for its students. This is openness in the sense that we're flowing out, and it's also a direct function of the breadth, the mix of Lego bricks that universities have to offer. So it's important to think about universities as hubs. You can also think about something like the BLI as a hub. This is a set of examples of what we call access opportunities, where we take the opportunity for students who are embedded in these networks to move out into the world and meet with alumni and others in their businesses, in their homes, in various places. This too is a way to make sure that problems and skills flow back to the university, even if it comes from the Gates Foundation or Boeing. This was a trip to Seattle. So the important thing to know here is that universities, by being stable, by having this capacity, by being open, right, by maintaining knowledge and teaching across all these different fields, enable people and ideas to flow back and forth in a fashion that ensures that we will have the capability to respond to problems and identify them, and that problems will find us in important ways and can move around. So that's what brings us back to creative capabilities at scale. Because universities are hubs, opportunities and problems flow to them. And we should do everything we can to keep ourselves hub-like. And that's a reason not to foreclose, in that Scott Walker style, the kinds of knowledge and training we do. Right? It's also a reason to think about maintaining openness and about how we partner with our other organizations so that we're interested but not controlling. Because they're sources, right, the knowledge and people in them are there to recognize and address problems. Right? There are lots of Lego bricks, and there are people who are learning how to put them together to deal with unknown unknowns, which means that we should be attending not just to an individual project, but to the capability that is built and to the ability to navigate those complicated networks and have those kinds of aha moments and get difficult work done in challenging situations. And finally, they're anchors, which means that they're a permanent endowment of skills, and that's why we need the public funding to continue. And the BLI and IRIS are two experiments in trying to do that. Thank you.
For that great talk. We have about 15 minutes before we're going to break for the reception for questions, and I trust that you're happy to moderate.
I am happy to moderate. Please ask me questions. Yes?
I enjoyed your talk, but the footprint you presented for the University of Michigan is too narrow. Mm-hmm. It's actually much more global. You only presented the United States.
Yep, that is absolutely true, and that is simply a function of a major data limitation at IRIS right now, which is that we partner with the US Census Bureau to get this data, and they can tell us nothing about the global reach. But in other variants of this talk, I'll throw up, for instance, if you go look for University of Michigan alumni associations, there are some absolutely marvelous logos. I particularly love the Thai University of Michigan Alumni Association logo. So that's another important point. And you might think about something like the International Institute here and the kinds of knowledge about the international world that are essential to many of the bigger than Google problems that I highlighted. Yes?
So your Google example reminded me of an argument that I heard a lot before, and then we took a different turn than we usually take, but I want to encourage you to walk further down. People often respond to these critiques or this idea that we should target grants more with the idea of serendipity.
Mm-hmm.
You can't predict what things are going to go, and the sort of traditional conclusion is, and so we need lots more grants like the Digital Libraries Initiative,
Mm-hmm.
right? That peer review, this targeted funding, find the project, but don't have politicians meddle.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if that's your conclusion, or if what you think is that maybe we don't need to be funding specific projects at all, and should have broader public investment in these networks. So are you going down the path of funding serendipitous individual projects is the right way to go, or is there another way to invest in these broader networks you're talking about?
Well, I think there are some really interesting possibilities for making broader investments at scale. I don't know how realistic they are, so Mary Sue chaired a AAAS program called the Lincoln Project. And one of the interesting things they suggested was to revive an old idea from the 1940s of a public endowment for universities, right, that would, at a scale like the National Science Foundation, spread endowed chairs and funding for graduate students across many universities across the country as a way to invest in exactly this kind of network infrastructure. I don't think we're ever going to get to, and I don't know that we want to get completely away from the peer-reviewed, investigator-driven grants, because part of the story I didn't tell is that these networks end up looking different on different campuses. And so it's not any one university that can respond to unknown unknowns. It's the fact that 100 different universities put similar knowledge together in different ways that help to ensure that we'll be able to do this. One way to do that is to make sure there's a mechanism for investigator-initiated grants to bubble up. So I would make an argument for a much bigger sustained investment aimed at the infrastructure, the institution, the networks, the people. I don't know if that's an investment that could be won, a battle that could be won, but I think there's potentially a coalition for it. I don't think it replaces the National Science Foundation, but it does add an interesting substrate, and it might speak to things like some of the indirect cost battles that are going on right now. Yes?
It's a similar question to follow up with the answer to that. Your map of collaboration at the university in some ways reminds me of like It looks very organic. And I'm curious about your take on whether or not there are mechanical processes that would be analogous to an organic process, the essence of it. And if that's one of the ways you think about the VLI as a kind of, for lack of a better term, a forcing of that process through mechanical terms.
I wouldn't say through mechanical terms. So the language I use is that these kinds of networks, whether they're students or they're researchers, can't really be engineered. Right? So the nature of a university, for those of you who are administrators, is that it's really hard to tell someone like me to go collaborate with somebody else because it would be good for the institution. Right? But what they can be, I think, is cultivated. And there's some interesting research we've been doing, there's more that thinks about the ways in which these networks grow in a couple of different registers. So you could think about knowledge space, people studying similar things. You think about organizational space, people in the same departments or colleges, people in the same disciplines or different ones, and physical space. The physical plant of the campus shapes possibilities for collaboration in interesting ways, which is why we see things like the biological research building, for instance. And so I think what's interesting, and I don't have an answer for it now, is to figure out two different views of how networks work. One, how a structure like this positions some people to be better able to make risky combinations. And two, how they grow and sustain themselves. Because one of the other features of universities that's really impressive is that they are conservative, not in a left-right sense, but in the sense that they reproduce themselves with a great deal of fidelity over time. At the same time, they are the source of an amazing flow of new ideas and new projects and new people. And I think that combination, right, the strong container for this ferment of ideas and networks is what we have to understand. So I'd say what we need to think about is things like, how could you sponsor colloquia or working groups that span existing disciplines but focus on a single part of knowledge space? So there's enough combination to allow different combinations. I think that's the work that research administrators and others at the institution can really engage in. I don't think there's a simple mechanical process that we could implement, but it's very much the kind of language that I use when I think about what we're trying to do in the BLI, is to create an environment where lots of different people are in the same place, pulling together around visions they create without us telling them what to do, but instead giving them this space and structure to develop and bubble up the ideas.
So, as you know, I'm a huge fan of IRIS and the ability to track the dollars and to know exactly what happened. But is there a fear, is there a worry that we'll start then trying to think we know more than we do about how to make the investments to get the outcome that we want? I mean, I think it's a double-edged sword, and I think a lot about it. While I'm totally enthusiastic about doing it, but how do you think about that?
That's a really hard question. So a more pointed version I got asked that once is, oh great, Jason, you've just shown this, and now my university's going to tell me I have to buy X% of my reagents from in-state. Right? So I might be naive, but I think knowledge is good. I think we're better able to have a real conversation when we can say, we know this is happening and here's how, than when we're stuck with, maybe you should build more garages. There is a double-edged sword, and it depends on how we use this information, which is one of the reasons that I think this needs to be founded on really good research, and that first and foremost, something like IRIS is not an advocacy organization, it's a research organization. And that what we do is work with institutions and associations and say, to the best of our ability, we can tell you that this is an 8-ounce glass and it's got about 4 ounces of water in it. You get to decide whether it's half full or half empty. So there is a danger. I think the danger of not being able to do this outweighs the danger that if we do it well, someone will try to manage us with it. Marvin.
So I think my question or concern is parallel in a way, because I think the Barger Leadership Institute has been very inclusive of all potential kinds of students and applications. And in IRIS, though, the tracking of money is singular, whereas not all intellectual inventions, things that mobilize new creativity are represented by money. How do you track those ideas that are also emerging often from universities?
Yep. It's the really hard problem. So the problem is, how do we get to real social impact in some sense? And how do we handle things that aren't grant funded, right? Much of the interpretive social sciences, the humanities, the arts, these have real impact on our society, but we can't articulate them in this framework, at least not with this data. So I think that in principle, these kinds of data that are very fine-grained and that track spending and associate them with people whose careers we can follow are the route to try to answer those kinds of questions. We can't do it now. The hard question is to ask, how do you go from an investment, not necessarily to a Google, but to cleaner water, lower infant mortality rates, right? A better, more humane, more just society? I don't have an answer. I know we're taking some steps to do things like try to understand how university faculty doing pro bono service work in places like federal advisory committees are carrying knowledge out of the university that's developed here and are potentially bringing problems back. And there you can see things like arts professors on NEH panels and, local economic development and national economic development, but we don't have an answer yet, and it's a huge problem. It's the thing, if I had an infinite amount of time, I'd go park myself at the Institute for Humanities for a couple of years and try to figure out how to do this kind of stuff. Instead, I will say, I hope there's a graduate student who will park themselves at the Institute for Humanities for a couple of years and try to figure out how to do this stuff. Yes?
I guess I'm trying to articulate what I will call the yes, but that's Stanford question.
Okay.
That being, almost every university has some success stories that they like to tell about a practical application of some basic research project. But many of them probably cannot track that backwards in the way that you've done to grants in 5, 6 different universities in different fields. If you could help institutions, the communications people, have some kind of template to make this case, it might be a kind of force multiplier, and people might be less inclined to say, well, that was a miracle, that's Stanford.
That's exactly the purpose, and that's sort of, I talked about the data at IRIS today, but it is really a consortium of universities. Next week, we're having what we call our data summit, which is about 60 representatives from, I think, 25 or so universities. Now Nancy's nodding at me, so I'll just make up those numbers and trust Nancy. Right, are coming together, and 2 of the panels are about how one uses data like this that's coming out of this to engage stakeholders on campus and to reach out beyond the campus to tell the story. So the key idea, I think, is that you're right, something like Google is a miracle. Right? It's not a miracle in the sense, although I do like the cat pictures, but it's an incredibly rare event. Right? And so if we want to be able to understand the social and economic and institutional conditions that routinely are capable of generating very real events, very rare events, we need to be able to see a wide range of them over time, which means we need all of these universities working with us, and to the extent that IRIS, working with groups like AAU and groups like the Big Ten Academic Alliance, can be clearinghouses for the best ways to talk and think about this, I think we'll be doing the force multiplier work, but the challenge, as always, is to balance, with Mary Sue's question, the research organization versus advocacy. And that's a hard thing to do, but it's in some sense, the metaphors that I described inform this idea of IRIS by making it to the anchor in the sense of interested but not trying to control, and a place where lots of connections come through. One more question. Tim.
Jason, I love this image of universities as this open source. They have very porous boundaries, allowing people in and out, ideas in and out, and all of that. And also the hub-like network. One thing you didn't talk much about is the fact that universities as hubs are connected perhaps first to other universities, right? In this very international network. One thing I've seen in my work in science is the way a scientific project can become almost unbelievably quickly a global project.
Yep.
going right past all kinds of levels of approval and just doing it, right? So could you talk about the ways in which that might be especially relevant as we address the kinds of global problems that you listed?
Yep. And that's, again, part of what you're seeing is Iris is 2 years old. So one of the ways to think about that, I showed you the network in a university. There's also the possibility of getting a sense of the networks across them. So one way to do that, again, limited slice for Marvin, but it follow the subcontracts. So you can draw the universities together and you can point to where they have connections outside the US and start to think not just about a bunch of individual universities sitting in their spot with stuff flowing to them, but about the channels and circuits that run around them. And an important thing to think is that this is one of the reasons why the structure of academia, where disciplines span institutions and people's careers move across places, provide these channels for that kind of information to flow. So I don't have an answer yet, but my suspicion is that there's more interesting meat in thinking about how connections among individuals turn a whole set of universities into a single network that does this work than there is in necessarily articulating the ways in which each individual university varies.
Jason, thank you. Thank you for such a terrific talk, and thank you for your leadership, not only in leadership education, but also in this fabulous scholarly project and the other work that you do. I just want to, on behalf of your colleagues in the college, I'd like to give you this modest gift.
Thank you.
Picture, guys, you got that? Right. So,
Thank you.
and please join us in the reception outside of the room.